XYZs are the second summoning mechanic that was later added to the game. As with all mechanics that have been added to the game, its inclusion brought out another wave of doomsayers, claiming the end times for the game were near. Of course, the game still exists today, so those fears were unfounded, as they usually are. The only crime of the mechanic is its name being confusing. It is written as XYZ, but of course, no one with self-respect calls them that, okay? So how are you meant to pronounce it? Well, there's Parallel Xyz and Firewall Exceed Dragon. Xyz makes sense based on the mechanic's design. You exceed the level limit. Sure, easy to understand, case closed. No, it's pronounced XZ. Personally, I was never really a fan of XYZs. I didn't hate them, the mechanic just didn't really resonate with me. The early design philosophy of XYZs was a rather depressing reality. Take a card like Goblinberg, for example. It's clearly designed for the sole purpose of making an XYZ easier to summon. Naturally, when you add a new mechanic, you'd want to make it actually accessible. However, this approach was very transparent. Main deck monster design was losing personal value, and instead being designed for the sole purpose of assimilation. It's kind of morbid. Yet, despite viewing the cards with this bleak perspective, I still saw the unique design it offered and appreciated that facet of the mechanic. Synchros were trending main deck monster design in this direction already. It's just when they became material for another card, and they were divorced from a theme of bonds and unity, the rose-tinted glasses of Synchro's harmonious nature cracked. However, XYZs are a far more well thought out and unique mechanic than Synchro. The materials are a resource for the majority of XYZs, which gives them a unique design restriction no other card type has, having effects limited to the materials that they can detach for cost, giving them an inherent way to deal with the once per turn dilemmas. This has contributed to the mechanic's identity standing the test of time. XYZ monsters require multiple monsters of the same level in order to be made. You then overlay them to create an XYZ whose rank is the same as their level. With rank being a separate classification, that gave these cards a unique workaround against cards like level limit. This brings a lot of design nuance to the table. The first card to really push XYZ summoning is Tour Guide from the Underworld. Considering the fact her existence was a warning shot, she was released in the final set of the 5Ds era. Bizarrely, you can't synchro with the card she summons. It was an enigma as to why they designed a card this way at the tail end of 5Ds. You'd think that they'd maybe give the mechanic one last hurrah with a one-card Synchro 6, but no. It wouldn't be too long before XYZs were revealed and her true purpose became known. Tour Guide would lead to one of the first ruling conundrums with XYZs. You see, Tour Guide could summon any level 3 fiend from deck or hand. And while that monster's effect was negated on field, that only applies while it's on field. Should the card go to grave and have an effect that triggers there, it activates. This was perfect with a card like Sangan. You could summon Tour Guide and overlay her with Sangan for Leviathan, detach Sangan and trigger its effect. Except you couldn't. Sangan needs to go from field to grave for the effect to activate. Yeah? He's clearly on the field. Look at him right there! Well, XYZ materials aren't on the field, they're just on the field. So cards that relate to XYZ now and want to trigger when sent to the grave will specify if sent to grave. Why does it function this way? What zone are XYZ material in? Beats me. I will now attempt to make up a fictional explanation for how this works. When you have the proper material for an XYZ summon, you are capable of creating a new zone that forms over top an existing zone. We'll use the anime terminology as reference and consider this building the overlay network, creating this unique zone that exists over top the existing field. The materials no longer exist on the field as they're creating this overlay network. This zone's existence makes your XYZ monsters appear to the field. Therefore, the materials are no longer on the field. Why doesn't the game have a legitimate or intuitive explanation for this? Well, it's probably because the next 2 times they tried that, it didn't go over so well. Might as well just leave it at because it just works that way. This all being said, the mechanic is well over a decade old at this point. So what has it amounted to from its early legacy up until now? Like every mechanic, not all of the card pool is created equal. The 2 ranks with the highest population density are 4 and 3, with 8, 7, and 6 fighting closely for 3rd place. Numerically speaking, rank 5 technically has the second highest population. However, because of something we'll be discussing later, a large majority of them might as well not count. And even then, you might notice the massive gap there is between first and second. Yeah, there might be an issue. I can't help but feel like this is due in part to Zexal itself. Yuma uses rank 4s almost exclusively, where Kite uses 8s and 4s. Meaning these card pools will always have the capacity to support these popular anime decks until time itself stops. But likely the biggest reason why the rank 4 pool is the behemoth that it is because level 4s are the most common in the game. Level 4 monsters tend to have decent stats for the most basic level of gameplay, and are typically key normal summons for a lot of archetypes. Naturally, this then establishes a much greater demand for rank 4s. The sheer amount of tools in the rank 4 pool is absolutely staggering. The instant classics of Silent Honor Arc, Castell, Exciton Knight, Daigusto, Diamond Direwolf, Giant Hand, and of course, Gagaga Cowboy. The more niche tools like Maestro, Papal Operative, Lightning Chidori, and Steel Swarm Roach. The late but still great hits of Redoer and Malevolent Sin, the most banned cards of all time, Laval Volchain, Rongo, and Shockmaster, cards like Karen Gorgon, a niche piece of interaction, as well as Evil Swarm Nightmare and Thanatos being nice tools for dark archetypes. There is just no shortage of tools in the rank 4 pool. There's a billion rank 4s that are just generic searchers. So any deck that can slap 2 4s down is likely to have a huge consistency boost with these. There are plenty of powerful rank 4 boss monsters, and unfortunately, there are 2 pretty prominent floodgate ones as well. This sort of toolbox brings up a dilemma though. Should Konami be designing similar toolboxes for every rank? I mean, obviously, no. Lazy, uninspired, repetitive design isn't going to help the identity of each rank pool. But also, if they're not XYZ locking, the Link pool is the only unifying toolbox for decks with varying levels and ranks. However, it's clear most of the other ranks have been left out to dry. We've seen a rank 1 strategy like Lyrillus crack into meta contention, with respect to Tri-Brigade. We've also seen Mimigul show up as well, but these are the only 2 dedicated rank 1 strategies in the game. The rank 1 pool itself only really offers Fusho and Princess Sprite. These aren't exactly unplayably bad, but they're certainly not a very robust toolbox for a card pool. Other rank 1s that exist are like Gold Rat and Baby Tyragon, cards that are unplayably bad, making the prospect of rank 1 strategies unappealing. With the rank 2 pool, Sprite sparked a renaissance for the number 2. However, the rank 2 pool isn't quite as robust enough to really push much. By all accounts, there are quite a few decent tools in the pool, which is more than can be said for most ranks, but it feels like it's just missing a couple more to really flesh it out. Mannequin Cat is a cool tool for the rank 2 pool, but I feel it's the only unique one available. Rank 2 also has access to Toad as a negate, which is a privilege most pools dream of, but Toad is also an honorary rank 4 negate as well. Not anymore, baby! When it comes to archetypes that are solely rank 2 oriented, there's only Paleo and Sprite. They of course have links, and Sprite is in a similar boat to Melfi where there's a clear focus on the number 2, since Melfi is also a Synchro 4 strategy. I'm not saying making these decks more than a pure rank 2 strategy is a bad thing, in fact, it is a good thing. But I can't help but notice, rank 4 has droves of archetypes dedicated to making rank 4s and nothing else. But when it comes to a lot of other ranks, archetypes tend to dip their toes or lean into other avenues. It just shows a lack of interest in wanting to flesh out these ranks. The rank 3 pool had its hits during the heyday of XYZs. It even still manages to have the second highest density to this day. Leviathan, an instant classic beater of the era. Leviair, who sets up combos with your banished monsters. Zenmains, an annoying sticky monster that slipped its way into plenty of decks. MX Saber Invoker, who went above the rank 4 searchers and just summoned the damn thing to the field. But since those cards, the rank 3 pool hasn't really gotten anything new to use. There are certainly powerful rank 3s under archetypes and engines, but seemingly nowhere near the same versatility the 4 pool has. Not only that, Materiactor is the only dedicated rank 3 strategy in the game. Wind-Up, Goblin Bikers, the Djinns, and Virtual World all have 3s, but just as I've said, it's not their only means of play. Materia Nectar can barely even be considered an archetype, and they could always very well choose to pivot later on. Even if you do count Goblin Bikers as a dedicated rank 3 strategy, it's also a recent archetype. The fact it's taken this long to actually start making predominantly rank 3 oriented strategies is concerning. The ranks of 5, 9, 11, and 12 all share a similar existential crisis. These rank pools almost exist solely as rank ups to lower ranks, something we'll get into later, but what's important to take from this is that these pools are by design the most underdeveloped, despite the rank 5 pool still being pretty accessible by normal means. Half of its cards consist of XYZs you aren't intended to summon traditionally. You have Adrius and Tiras, who were decent back in the day, but then you have Shark Fortress and Pleiades. Solid cards in a vacuum, but underwhelming prospects for any deck that can make rank 5s, especially since Pleiades requires lights. Until recently, the only rank 5 archetype in the game was Artifact. I can only assume the reason the higher ranks are as underdeveloped as they are is because they're not normal summonable without tributing, and the idea of spamming out 5s is too scary for Konami. You know, if you add 1 star to every Rise Eel, suddenly there's a problem. It's only now we've gotten a new rank 5 strategy with K9, and Konami's fear of summoning 5s easily is still palpable. Normal summon without tribute. Konami needs to stop printing every 5 as Sidra or Sidra but worse. Get over it. Summoning 5 and higher without tributing is the least unbalanced thing happening in the game right now. The rank 7 pool had a robust generic lineup early in their lifespan. Big Eye, Dracosac, and Gaia Charger were all powerful tools back in the day. They even had solid removal from modern day in Volo and Dark Armed Annihilation. Other than the elephant in the room, both Odd Eyes and Red Eyes are 2 level 7 centric archetypes that have their share of rank 7s. So there's plenty of incentive for the rank 7 pool to be fleshed out in general. And once again, when it comes to dedicated strategies for the rank, pickings are slim. The latest Dragon Ruler support calls back to their service for the rank, and retcons them into actually being a rank 7 strategy. Atlantean only has rank 7s, but the archetype is a shell company for Mermail, so I don't know if you count that. The only definitive true rank 7 archetype that exists is Kashtira. What a great reputation this rank must have as a result of that. Both the rank 6 and 10 pools feel shallow, just as I've said with others, with the only real rank 10 strategy being trains, and Tistina very awkwardly encroaching in on the space, and rank 6 having 0 dedicated archetypes, unless you hold on to hope that one day there'll be more than 1 Hazy Flame and Jinzo XYZs in the game, which is a shame because the rank 6 pool also has some decent tools, but unfortunately, all it gets used for is Beatrice. And now that she's been executed in all formats, the lack of any full-on rank 6 strategy leaves the pool falling into obscurity. So what's the real issue with these card pools nowadays? Well, the obvious issue is the blatant favoritism. 4, 8, and 7 are the most common levels in the game, meaning you're way more likely to see archetypes that feature those ranks. Rank strategies other than them are few and far between. Konami, being afraid of designing high-level monsters you dump out en masse is a moot point. All it's doing is holding back opportunities for ranks other than 4 to be explored. We have an archetype like Generator as the only singular rank 9 archetype, and that helps sort of contribute to their gameplay identity. But since there isn't an initiative to design generic rank 9s, they're never going to get new tools, unless they receive direct support, and sometimes it can be nice to have support that isn't archetypal. It can be a way to bridge more archetypes together, or offer powerful tools to select decks with the requisite levels, but that requires there even be more in the first place. When it comes to seeing playable strategies of various different ranks, it feels like they're just being lazy and not charting new territory. We have Ryzeal, a modern tiered rank 4 strategy that is making good use of the existing rank 4 pool. You have Exosister, a rank 4 strategy that, for the most part, stuck to its own XYZs and performed well in a specific metagame. There's Kashtira, a rank 7 strategy that dominated for a time. Oppressively so, though that was due to a degenerate playstyle. These 3-tiered strategies utilize the existing highest populated ranks. Sprite made rank 2s pretty important, and they were a meta deck. Surely we're getting somewhere now, right? Just one more good rank 2 archetype, and maybe the card pool will reach its full potential. If only they just made another one of those. So, Pearly is a good segue to start talking about the more unique and deeper aspect of XYZ materials. Typically, what you see is what you get. Just a guy that loves 2/3s and adventure. But not every XYZ is that simple. Sometimes, despite what the card denotes, they're made with less traditional means. Pearly is an archetype with rank 2s and 7s, yet the only existing main deck names are level 1. You see how things aren't adding up? Pearly aimed to use the mechanic in an entirely different way from the norm. While other archetypes were slapping a big dude over 2 dudes with the same number, Pearly was using one of its little guys in conjunction with its spells to make an XYZ. These spells representing the memories that they make with their owner, which in turn leads to them being shaped into the XYZ you want, gaining additional effects based on the memories attached to them, with the deck focusing on building as many memories with your Pearly as possible, reflecting the strength of your bond with your Pearly, and translating that to stacking them all underneath the XYZ to make them far more powerful in gameplay. Pearly's thematic design and take on the mechanics set it apart greatly and made it into a memorable tiered strategy. Honestly, I didn't care that much for Pearly initially, until someone described it as being like raising a Chow in Sonic Adventure. Then my view on Pearly changed radically. While Pearly has some design issues, I would like to see them get more support, and maybe even expand further on the memory gimmick. Like Chows from Sonic, it'd be funny to see the Pearlies take on the shape of other characters in the game. That could either be the cast of the animes, or somewhat of a meta take on resembling bosses of archetypes that could synergize with Pearly, like a twisted evil Dark World Pearly. Just whatever they do, don't make the support a dementia wave. While Pearly is one of the first XYZ archetypes to draw eyes to XYZ without monsters as soul materials, there were archetypes with a similar design that people overlooked. Time Thief is an archetype that revolves around time, past, present, and future. This is represented through gameplay in the areas they attach material from, the grave being the past, the field the present, and the deck the future. Their XYZ denote gaining additional effects based on the card types attached to them as material, with Raidou being the star of the show. Time Thief's going to get a video of its own one day, so for now I'll just talk about Raidou himself since he's the core of their identity. During the standby phase, he rips a card off the top of your opponent's deck and attaches it as material. You can detach materials from him and apply effects depending on the card types he detached. If you detach a monster, he can banish himself until the end phase. He'll almost always have a monster attached as material, and since he attaches a card from your opponent's deck at standby, and monsters are the most common type, he'll likely always have this effect online. If you detach a spell card, you can draw a card. Simple and solid. If you detach a trap, he has non-targeting, non-destruction removal. All of these effects make him an absolute menace in lower-powered formats. But in the context of the main game, he's just chillin'. Tier played him. Sometimes, but that's about it. He's not bad, but he certainly isn't a first draft in a rank 4 call. More recently, Materiactor went from a couple weird cards to an actual dedicated rank 3 strategy that expands on the usage of materials. Like Time Thief, they intend to make their XYZ the traditional way, then attach spell traps through other means. The melt spells all stack your deck and provide a way to attach the top card to an XYZ. The XYZ have effects to return materials attached to them to hand, allowing you to recur materials by design, something that most XYZ decks don't usually bother with. Soulless is a card that makes this dynamic very interesting. Since you can put spell traps underneath a Materiactor, this can functionally be a roundabout way of searching a spell trap. The issue is the melt cards aren't super reliable. Critical draws direct attention to card types by providing different effects based on which one you detach. The issue is, once again, the deck isn't too good at letting you get spell traps underneath an XYZ. And unfortunately, Materiactor is a rank 3 deck, and the majority of trap monsters are level 4, so they can't even cash in on those. Materiactor is a really interesting prospect in design, but as it exists now, is a bit of a letdown. So, we've talked about cards that use spells and traps as material. What could be crazier than using spells and traps as materials? Well, using more than 2 monsters, of course. Yeah, it turns out converting 3 or more cards to 1 isn't a very economical decision. Very few times have 3 or more material XYZs been playable, and the few times they were was with Shockmaster and Rongo, cards that were completely degenerate. There have been 3 mat XYZs worth playing that aren't degenerate, although they still highlight a separate issue with the matter. While there can be a balance in power level for ones that require 3 materials, they have another uphill battle to contend with. 3 or more materials brings us back to the dilemma of cards that exist solely as XYZ material, requiring 3 monsters that function for no other purpose but to be shoved under an XYZ. Teller Knights are one of the most historically competent XYZ decks, even including their 3 mats. However, you still hear the archetype regarded with derision for being boring, since they just spam out guys without any real gameplay nuance involved in between that. Ryzeal is a modern meta XYZ strategy with a lot of the same complaints, having all their main deck names designed with the sole purpose of loading the board for XYZs. And well, when they used 3 mat XYZs, we returned to the other concern. With synchros, because of how they functioned, requiring more than 2 materials was a process of threading a needle. XYZs only have to deal with the basic concern of getting the correct number of bodies on field, something that doesn't require as much deliberation. This leaves these sorts of XYZs to be rather boring and dull in execution most of the time. Konami has started to implement cards that can be treated as more than 1 material for a 3 mat, but this skirts around the design nuance concern. Most cards that require 3 or more materials aren't even intended to be made properly, as they're rank ups or evolutions of a 2 mat XYZ, with most of them being near or entirely impossible to summon. I know you can technically properly make these, but God did not intend for you to do that. So the few that actually do want you to have to be more creative in design, and sadly, that's lacking. Alimbertion is perhaps one of the only really creative uses of multi-mat XYZ, being an XYZ that has a different effect for how many materials you detach from it. If you detach 2, which you normally will be, you can search a math mech, making the card good in its native archetype with the least materials for the easiest turnaround. If you can manage 3 materials though, you can search any level 4, and if you can get 4, you can search any spell trap in the game, effectively acknowledging the issues with multi-mat XYZ and providing strong effects in the case you can manage more. Unlike Rongo and Shockmaster, instead of outright floodgating your opponent out of the game, Alimbertion allowed you the ability to search a pivotal card that may not be archetypal. Of course, Alimbertion's effects have never really been used for anything sane, or even good, but I still think it serves as a benchmark for good design on multi-mat XYZ. It just needs more experimentation. The worst of 3 mat XYZ can be traced down to ranks below 4, cards like Baby Tyragon, Gold Rat, and Shark Caesar. These are cards that, while yes, don't have good effects inherently, also serve to highlight how 3 mat requirements just don't line up with certain levels because they have nowhere near the number of free bodies that 4 has. So this design aspect, that's already on rickety foundation, struggles even more for the underrepresented ranks. This is especially egregious with rank 3s, since Konami thought it'd be cute if the rank of 3 had a sizable portion of XYZ that require 3 material. Despite the prospect of an XYZ having more material, and therefore more resources for its effects, it feels as though Konami struggles to meaningfully make that connection in their design. There are some, like Lyrilusc Assembled Nightingale, that uses its material count to determine its stats and how many times it can attack, but those feel few and far between. But back onto the more positive design of XYZ materials. While there is an inherent concern with materials being designed solely as XYZ material, there is another approach to that philosophy that adds far more flavor to their design. These types of monsters are in 2 subcategories that are generally the same. Monsters that provide unique effects to an XYZ while they're attached to them, and monsters that apply effects to an XYZ that is summoned with them. There is a nuance between the two, and we might as well start by highlighting the issue one faces over the other. Suship is one of, if not my favorite XYZ archetype, as all of their XYZ are designed in a way that nets them unique effects when made with the correct material. Not only does it dissuade making them with more generic material, which thematically could be seen as making your sushi with cheaper alternatives, it encourages you to mix the correct ingredients for the most value out of your XYZ, making the perfect dish. The problem though is that the effects apply on summon. So if you attach a material after the fact, they don't gain the effect. And if the application gets negated, then they never receive the effects. I feel like Soulless is the perfect XYZ archetype in design philosophy, since it encourages you to use your resources more thoughtfully than just dumping bodies onto the board. But of course, that's only in the context of the archetype itself, and unfortunately, they only have 3 XYZs, and they aren't exactly the best. I'll talk about Soulless one day, but for now, that's all that needs to be said about it here. The other type of material bonus effects can be best demonstrated with Zodiac, with each of their main deck names providing different benefits to a Beast Warrior XYZ that has them as material. Notably, they don't specify the XYZ has to be a Zodiac, so they can also provide bonuses to generic Beast Warrior XYZs, but that's a little too hard to finagle for any fruitful results. The Zodiac that draws attention to the fact they aren't required to be used for the XYZ summon for the effect to apply is Whiptail, being the only one that allows you to quick effect attach it from hand or field to an XYZ. Whiptail gives an XYZ that has it as material the ability to banish monsters that it battles, and in the context of Zodiac specifically, is a way to slip 1200 attack under one of their XYZs on the fly. It isn't a once per turn either. The only curse, or blessing when we get to a certain card, is that Whiptail is the only zoo that can quick effect attach itself. Personally, I enjoy the idea of attacking with a main deck monster, then slotting them under an XYZ to boost them. It feels like a neat mechanical translation of Synchro's theme of harmony, but for the functionality of XYZs. But, well... There's also an inverse design philosophy that follows the same principle as these two monster types. But instead of placing the bonus on the inherent material names, it's placed on the XYZ itself to correlate with the type of materials it has. Teardrop, the Rika Queen, and Volafurnagus are XYZs that, when made with monsters of the same monster type, gain the added benefit that their effects become quick effects, meaning they still have the versatility to be used more generically, but will yield much greater results in archetype. Evolzar Lars is a similar case, but with a different take. Instead of the material type determining the effect's spell speed, it instead determines the number of materials required to detach. And since its effect isn't once per turn, this means it can be applied more than once, provided you're playing it in its intended environment. Super Quants is an archetype that combines both the importance of names and improved effects based on them being attached. The issue with the deck is that they aren't very good at making XYZs without the field spell. How did this happen twice? It makes the XYZs with just one monster on field. Since none of them share levels, it's hard for them to actually make an XYZ the way God intended. The new support does address this. Zayton actually allows for a way to XYZ summon correctly, but it's the only card of the 3 to do that. Black Lair creates a roundabout way of XYZ summoning, pitching a card to summon itself, then XYZ summon, and attach a Quant Engrave as XYZ material, with the pitch likely determining the XYZ you summon if you don't have other names engraved. Lair 19 is another piece of solid support, but I feel like the deck needs another good name that makes XYZ summoning easier to really function. This type of XYZ design really does highlight a good way to balance the genericness of XYZ with the inherent design of the mechanic, while also still making the cards very powerful in their native decks. But now, we might as well talk about the ugly duckling of this philosophy. Odd Eye's Rebellion and Raging introduce a convoluted process with materials, requiring you to XYZ summon them using an XYZ to gain their full effects. Most cards designed like these outright state you can just overlay XYZs, but for these, you have to go through the effort of converting an XYZ rank to a level, and when you consider the fact they wanted you to make them with these cards, Zhang Sheng Magician, the actual worst card I've ever seen in my life, yeah, these are a little too delirious in design. However, cards that are delirious in the opposite direction exist. I'm referring to cards like Dingirsu and Gigantic Sprite. Dingirsu is a powerful rank 8 that you can't make in its native archetype. At least, not in the way the mechanic itself functions. You can slap it on any one Yorkist Link monster, sort of defeating the entire purpose of the mechanic by using one material that isn't even a level, but there is contextual info relevant to justify this design. Since it was released during Master Rule 4, being able to convert a Link into a full-on XYZ was a convenient way to make them easier to actually summon. It's just the fact that it's an Yorkist card, and when any two cards was full Yorkist combo, this card was a little too generic. And not because it was a generic rank 8, Gigantic Sprite is a more interesting take on Dingirsu, turning every Link 2 into a level 2 for its XYZ summon, requiring you still actually XYZ summon it, but one of the materials can be a Link. It gives an actual connecting thread between the two mechanics, unlike Dingirsu, who was more concerned with skirting around the issue with the rules of the time. The only issue is that you can only really do this sort of thing with the number 2 or 1 with links, because there's no way you're converting a Link 3 into a level 3. At least, not unless you're doing it for a completely degenerate reason, in which case, the novelty isn't worth it. While I may talk about Dingirsu as being the less inspired of the two, it does still have a design nuance to it that can be replicated. It is a generic rank 8, so the context of being able to slap it on an Yorkist Link to more easily make in its native archetype is sound. Just a shame it doesn't really leverage the XYZ mechanic itself in a unique way. I would have liked to have seen it gain benefits based on the link rating of the Yorkist attached to it, making a point of the material used affecting the card uniquely. The detach protection effect is there, along with the attach effect, but it's designed in such a reserved way that it misses the mark in my eyes. Yorkists did get support recently, so if they get more, I'd be interested in seeing them expand on XYZs in the deck, just don't think that's likely. The last thing to talk about in regards to XYZ materials is tokens, as they can't be used for XYZ summon. Since tokens disappear when they leave the field, and since the overlay network is a fictional area that's known on the field, tokens can't be used for them. Boy, I sure do love it when the explanation for mechanics boils down to because. Really coherent design structure. Speaking of, Mecha Phantom Beast is a token-centric archetype with an XYZ. Yeah, so I'm not entirely sure what the thought process here was. They have synchros, which can be made using tokens, but this ain't Sword Soul. Who do you think the tuners are in this deck? You need to modulate the main deck bodies to even XYZ summon Dracosac, but also use the tokens with one of the tuners to synchro. This is a really cool design gimmick to flex the differences between the two mechanics in one archetype, just a shame they didn't actually bother to make the deck function that way, as the only place you'd be summoning Dracosac was in Dragon Rulers. Now that we've finished talking about cards that can't be materials, let's go back to talking about cards that can be. So, as it turns out, you can XYZ summon with XYZs in select scenarios. This type of XYZ has a multitude of different variations. We might as well start by talking about the original concept behind this design. Rank Up is a sub-mechanic wherein you do what you think you'd do with a name like that. You make an XYZ that's one rank higher than an XYZ you control, using that card as material for its summon. Notably, this transfers the materials of the original XYZ over to the new one. Rank Up XYZs come directly from the anime, as they're either CXZ or C whatever number the original XYZ is. These cards are what make up the majority of XYZs that require 3 or more materials, as you're not actually intended to make them traditionally. Though it is sort of questionable to even bother in the first place, seeing as most of them only have their good effects with the lower rank XYZs attached. While it would have been far too chaotic and creatively draining to give a chaos form to every non-anime XYZs, I wish they did give more XYZs rank ups. They could even take a similar approach that Mega Evolution did in Pokemon, serving as a chance to give old outdated bad XYZs a new form that makes them playable. And in the case of a card game, this is way more manageable to balance. The biggest setback in design of rank up XYZs is that they require a spell referred to as a rank up magic in order to do so. This means that any deck that uses them needs to be able to consistently find a way to one in order to do it. Despite it being 2025, not all of them have gotten that far, which is really funny when you consider the fact Utopeea had already figured out the secondary pathing for this sub-mechanic 13 years ago, allowing you to just summon Utopea's CXZ over top of him without a rank-up magic. Although Utopeea isn't free of criticism either. Rank Down is another sub-mechanic that you can perhaps easily infer the functionality of. Utopeea is not only the progenitor of this mechanic, but also the only one to use it. Having a rank down spell that only exists to summon one monster. A monster you wouldn't bother summoning in the first place. You can rank down the bigger Utopeea XYZs, but you could also just not do that. It's unfortunate that this portion of the mechanic was left as just an anime flash in the pan. It could have been a unique design element for the mechanic to utilize, but oh well, I guess. Despite how long rank ups have been around, we only have one archetype in the game where the whole game plan is tied to them, that being Raid Raptor. They're an archetype whose theme revolves around rebellion, and uses the fact that they rank up after falling as a means of conveying an undying will for revolution. They're a rank 4 strategy in base, but ascend all the way up to the top. The deck has like 8 different rank up magics, so it opens up a lot of unique space for how rank ups are applied, since beforehand every existing rank up was just slap a chaos form on top of a guy. The reason we likely haven't seen much other experimentation with rank up oriented archetypes is because XYZ Evolution exists. For all intents and purposes, it's just rank up but without the need for a spell card. Of course, some of the most popular examples of these cards are Cyber Dragon Infinity and Beatrice, but their entire archetypes didn't revolve around evolution. It was just a useful bridging tool. And when you consider the fact it's so easy to pivot into, it's probably for the best the design has fewer applications than more. One archetype that kind of revolved around evolution was Trains. Trains are a rank 10 strategy that just get 2 big guys on field and make a huge train, with their 2 picks being an asshole that burns you, who is a soft once per turn by the way, and a giant asshole that can provide quick effect protection. Gustav is responsible for a fair share of FTK shenanigans, whereas Super Dora is actually more of a defensive card to give the deck legs going first without FTKing. While Train, like other archetypes, only has 1 evolution, it's clear they only need the 1. You can summon it over any rank 10 machine. I'm glad Super Dimensional Robo Galaxy Destroyer has been included in something. By detaching a material, it gains 2000 attack and defense, when it already has 4k stats, and can attack monsters for every material still attached to it, almost definitely killing your opponent if they have more than 1 monster in attack. And considering Gustav's 2k burn damage, it's likely a guarantee. The real takeaway is that Liba is designed as your win con, whereas most evolutions are designed as an important control card or combo piece. The one archetype to use evolution as its main deal is Digital Bug. I mean, there's the Galaxy Cipher cards, but do you really want me to count the weird inbred cousin of Galaxy Ice? Digital Bug is a rank 3 archetype, but they're designed in such a way that you're meant to keep evolving your bug 2 ranks up by detaching 2 materials. The issue is, when you detach 2 materials from your rank 3 to make the rank 5, you have 1 material on it, so it can't evolve again. The 2 lower end ranks are all designed with effects to attach more materials to them, but these are slow and clunky, even for the time they were made. Even more insulting, Scare Radiator has a detach 2 effect that synergizes with Corbage, but since you detach 2 for its effect, you can't make Corbage to capitalize on it. It feels as though Konami were scared of an archetype being able to evolve so easily, so they gave them a detach cost to curb them, but didn't realize that they'd already made the deck low-powered enough that it didn't need that balancing applied to begin with. I'd like to see Digital Bug make a comeback at some point, but considering the fact Konami probably doesn't even remember these cards exist, I'm not holding my breath. XYZ Devolution is a mechanic? There are cards like Raider's Knight, Salamangrate, Blaze Phoenix, and Seeksy Nash Knight that are designed with the ability to summon out a lower rank XYZ over top of them, but it's not really concretely defined like XYZ Evolution. If anything, I think if Konami isn't going to design an archetype that has rank up and down because of the conflicts with all the spells, designing an XYZ deck that has evolution and devolution to give you branched gameplay sounds very fascinating. It just takes some elaboration on if this is actually a thing or not. Other XYZs that you can slap over top of an XYZ are cards like Downerd and Zeus, with the latter being a card that can be slapped over top of the former. Downerd isn't a particularly good card. However, it's a body to slap over top of a rank 3, which can then have Zeus slapped on top. And since Zeus's main effect pertains to materials, this is her true purpose. Zeus is a card that can go in any XYZ deck and likely will. He's also a good segue into another set of cards. Zodiac is an archetype that makes XYZ with 1 monster, and allows for you to summon over top of the XYZ with another XYZ. The only real design limitation being that only 1 copy per name can be included in the stack. This sort of design allowed for the entire archetype to be the deck's full combo regardless of what names you drew, as you could cycle through all of the XYZ and use their effects, which set you up. When you consider the fact this archetype was capable of stacking so many materials onto 1 body, and the fact they have a direct attacker, you can kind of infer the relation this archetype has with Zeus. I will say, the most evil thing about Zoo is that the deck stole Digital Bug's flow, slapping XYZs over top of one another to cycle effects, and ending on a card that can pop a monster. The only real difference being that Trident can be drawn naked, so she gets the ability to pick her target instead of being restricted to only destroying the monster with the highest of a stat. Zexal Field is a weird field spell that allows you to attach an XYZ from grave or extra deck to an XYZ when you summon it. Theoretically, this makes it so you can make a rank up the way God did not intend, but still get the original number underneath of it as material. The problem with that, though, is none of the rank ups are worth that effort. You can of course also do this generically. Exo-Sister Magnifica allows you to send back an XYZ attached to them to perform an XYZ summon and transfer all its materials underneath the card you summon. In conjunction with a card like Zexal Field, you can slide an XYZ under them on your turn, then on your opponent's turn, summon it. Then when Zexal Field triggers again, you can put an XYZ underneath that summoned monster. This is a very interesting interaction. However, it just isn't, because there's actually nothing remotely fruitful in gameplay that can come from it. You can make General Kaiser this way. You probably won't, but you could. What's more important about Magnifica, though, is its material cost, requiring 2 XYZs in order to summon. That's right. The penultimate iteration of XYZ summoning with XYZs is the one that is literally that statement, although cards like these are few and far between. Magnifica is the only XYZ to do this and not be related directly to the Zexal anime. In Zexal, these XYZs are typically referred to as rank 0, even though they're treated as being rank 1. Numeron Dragon functions similarly, but more bizarrely. We just got a new rank 0, and it seems as though this design element is solely reserved to Yuma's cards. Since Magnifica isn't a rank 0, she's a rank 8. Explain. How does 4 plus 4 equal 0 and 8? We also have the opposite end of the spectrum with rank 13s. Until recently, Numeronia was the only rank 13 in the game. This was because it was a rank up of a rank 12, being the final boss monster of Zexal. Raidraptor would be given a rank 13 of its own, setting out to have an indestructible boss monster that carries out the will of all the XYZs that fell to make it, wiping your opponent's board and then burning them for the sum of all attack stats present, provided it has 3 or more XYZs as material. Then it can detach 3 and add an XYZ stat line onto it, inheriting the will of those who fell in order to bring the game to an end. Or at least it would if you didn't cap out at 7,800. Rank 0 and 13 are very interesting ideas for XYZ decks, but kind of fall flat in execution, with Rebellion Falcon being the only strong entry so far. Utopic Draco Future is a card you can make with Utopic Future. The reason I mention UDF first is because it's the better card. Utopic Future exists as another extra deck slot cost for running UDF. The ability to make them generically sounds promising, especially since UDF is an insanely strong card. However, we come to a second layer of the earlier dilemma about material. If you're overlaying 2 XYZs, you're admitting that the XYZs that you used weren't worth leaving on the field, which is a sign that any archetype that would want to make them has a different problem. Zooship is an XYZ archetype that comes to mind in regards to UDF, because all of the Zooship XYZs aren't particularly good. Only one of them has an interactive effect, and even then I use the word interactive loosely, so it serves more as an admission of poor design on any XYZ archetype that actually needs it to fill in for the deck's weaknesses. There's also the fact that you could be making XYZs that provide a purpose for combo, but then serve no real purpose beyond that. This is evident with the Ghost Trick Extra Deck engine that can make it with any 2 level 1s or level 3s. Of course, you could also just make it in the deck that it's actually intended for, and well... I couldn't really work it into another section, but I still think it's worth discussing because it's the poster child of the mechanic. Just like Synchron for Synchro and Hero for Fusion, Utopeea blows. People got mad at me for my disdain for Synchron. They're going to get mad about me disliking Automat, and they're definitely going to get mad at me about Hero in the Fusion video. The issue isn't that they're protagonist decks, it's in how Konami seems to approach designing protagonist decks. Utopeea intends to summon a bunch of XYZs and, surprise surprise, like Synchron, wants you to barf out multiple negates. Once again, not really aiming to do something unique with the mechanic, or even foster a healthy and defined playstyle. Synchron and Onomat are both needlessly convoluted combo decks that have a basic end board, hoping that the act of slapping down 15 Synchros, or in the case of Onomat, XYZs down, is enough for your dopamine receptors to explode. It treats your anime nostalgia as though it can be cheaply distributed just as fast food. And some of you stare at this shit like it's a Big Mac. This sort of design doesn't really appeal to the boomer anime fans because it's the type of design they hate, and it doesn't even serve as a good starting point for new players to learn the mechanic. They're entirely relying on you pogging at the billionth summon of Utopic Scrumblar, rather than you actually enjoying any sort of mechanical design or the gameplay loop. Pendant links aren't in this discussion because they won't let you play a single pendulum card nowadays, and because by the game's modern design, you're basically slapping down a billion links no matter what deck you're playing, which only really highlights how cheapened their existence is in these decks, as they're just functionally replicating the worst modern design has to offer with links. But hoping that by printing it with the card frame color that doesn't trigger your sensitivity training, you won't go ballistic about how the game was ruined by the biracial cards. Utopeea Dragon R is a neat boss monster for Onomat on paper. Sadly, there's just an objective, always best option to be summoning off of it. The fact something like Master Key Beetle is being summoned just as often as Golrat from this thing is proof there's a problem. There's not an actual cool gameplay integration of how Yuma used numbers as a situational toolbox. You're just barfing out a negate. Utopeea specifically has a payoff, and that's its OTK strategy. While OTK strategies are very limited in how unique they can be, Utopea's appeals to my ape brain in a philosophical way most other OTK strategies don't. What if you don't attack with big number, but attack with bigger number? Truly a deep and complex query that has stumped even the greatest philosophers in history. Utopea's attack negation effect is something you can use to either negate an oncoming attack or your own. Typically, the former was used back in the day, since negate attack on a beater was acceptable boss monster design. But negating your own attack wasn't really that good. Because of the window in which you can activate the effect, you couldn't really use it to reactively dodge a sudden troubled battle. There also wasn't a secondary payoff to negating your own attack. At least, not without double or nothing, allowing you to attack again, but with doubled stats should your attack have been negated. In an ironic twist, Utopea's worst usage of the effect is the one that aged the best, which is more likely due to the fact it was an iconic part of the anime. Another facet of Utopea's design ties in with this strategy. You can just slap like 50 different variants of Utopeea on top of the original, with the one you can't slap over top of him being the prominent double, allowing you to search double or nothing, slap a Utopeea on top of it, then double its attack, letting you double the stats twice functionally. I like the gameplay versatility of Utopeea forms and this OTK payoff, but the fact this sort of design philosophy isn't utilized effectively for the whole strategy really serves as a bummer. There's absolutely something interesting the deck can do mechanically, it's just that they don't really care to flesh it out when you can just vomit out Hope Harbinger instead. The majority of people tend to like mechanics overall, and XYZ is no exception. However, the sizable portion of indifference speaks to me because I'm sort of in that camp. As mentioned before, despite the mechanical nuance of XYZ, the lack of creativity through most of its lifespan in the game has left me uninterested in them. It seems to me a clear sizable portion of people see the mechanic as being dull as a result. For those that do enjoy the mechanic, I can only imagine it's for the few instances where the mechanic actually manages to wield its depth, either in design nuance or in the toolbox nature of rank pools. When it comes to the XYZs that people think of when they think of the mechanic, the top 3 picks were, in first, Utopeea, second, Zeus, and third, Dark Rebellion. Utopeea is self-explanatory, he's the main XYZ from Zexal. He was the first XYZ in the game. Zeus is another one that's obvious from a gameplay perspective, as he's a card that can go in any XYZ deck, and has had many appearances in the metagame. Dark Rebellion is kind of surprising though. This is an Arc 5 fans only pick. While Dark Rebellion has the benefit of including the mechanic in his name, he sort of wasn't that good for his time. You can do far better than have a monster's attack with a generic rank 4. But Dark Rebellion probably is my favorite XYZ just because he's so cool. He was also my first XYZ that wasn't Burner Visor, so that was a step up. Other than Zeus being second in the XYZ that people think of when they think of the mechanic, he's also the most common XYZ people see, and it's not very hard to imagine why. He's a card that can be summoned in any XYZ deck, period. In select questions where I mention XYZ stacking materials, I chose to include options pertaining to how they would interact with the existence of Zeus, with the majority of people preferring the option to forego his involvement in said scenarios. People's direct thoughts on the card itself resulting in a decent mix. Most people see Zeus as a necessary staple, but a sizable portion also view him as a limitation of card design, which, regardless of its representation in this question specifically, still rings loud with the context of the other two that made note of Zeus's impact on card design. There are also a decent chunk of people indifferent to Zeus and don't really see an issue one way or the other. Zeus is a card I go back and forth on if I actually like it being legal or not. There are a lot of aspects to its design that make it a phenomenal card all around, but sometimes the line between a powerful going second tool and a game-breakingly strong card blurs. The deck that first illustrated just how powerful Zeus could be, fittingly, was Zoos. Zodiac's very own design has you stacking multiple guys on top of one another, with one of said guys being a direct attacker, allowing for you to easily fulfill Zeus's summon requirement, all while having a ton of materials. I've played Zoo plenty of times. I could not tell you a single optimal, well thought out line in the deck. I never got competent with it, and I never had to. Because, as it turns out, if you can just very easily make Zeus with 6 materials, you win a lot of games. In this sense, I don't think Zeus is a healthy card. It limits card design for archetypes that load up on materials, as they'll almost always lean into Zeus, and in said decks, it only encourages being worse at the game. Because a monster that can rapid fire board wipes multiple times in the same chain is absurdly broken. However, there is still nuance to Zeus being balanced in this context. With Zodiac, you're committing a sizable portion of your extra deck to Zeus and all of its materials, meaning that doing so limits what you can run in the extra, and the extra deck is usually far too tight for that sort of commitment. So, realistically, you would just be playing Zodiac itself. There are select decks that don't care too much for their extra deck space, but if you're relying on swinging in with just a Borbo to make a fat Zeus, you're extremely susceptible to any form of interruption. When we leave the context of Zoo and look at decks that stack multiple materials from the main deck, that's when things start to get more iffy. Since there are now less balancing measures to prevent you from making a giant Zeus and rapid firing your opponent out of the game, the only intrinsic balancing measure left on Zeus, in this scenario, is that the board wipe applies to both players, potentially preventing you from making a lethal push or building a stronger board to prolong the game, at least not without potentially burning a ton of resources that you probably could have used more effectively. This is the last bastion of a healthy restriction on Zeus, but now as the game leads further and further into insane recursion and one-card combos, the potential risk becomes far less risky. While Zeus can always be made in any XYZ deck for a single board wipe, or maybe 2 if the deck's capable of stacking their XYZ, either by attaching an additional material from an effect, or using a rank up or evolution to give Zeus more juice, it makes the fact that he can fire his effect in response to a negate of the first activation feel satisfying and rewarding, being able to make a card that is guaranteed to level the playing field while still making you work to earn it. In these scenarios, Zeus feels extremely fair, but these aren't all scenarios. It's why I find it hard to say definitively if I want the card being legal. I do like Zeus's hidden effect that most people forget about, being able to attach a material to it from hand, deck, or extra if another card you control is destroyed. Comedically, this effect is a once per turn. When you consider this effect only triggers from battle destruction and opponent's effect destruction, it feels kind of pointless. Your opponent blows up a card, you attach a material. Do you think they're gonna do it again? You also had to go to battle already to make Zeus, so it's not even like you could abuse it by crashing monsters to fuel up Zeus. I guess the only concern is that by attaching any card from deck to Zeus, there's something horrifying you could do, but if you cared about that, why would you print the ability to do so on the card in the first place? We would then eventually receive Zeus's arch nemesis, Typhon. You see, this thought-out statement that sounds rational was a trap. You've all been played. This is the worst card ever printed. Typhon prevents you from summoning once he hits the field, so it's an all-in commitment. It requires you use your biggest monster for its summon. While this usually can be worked around, boy oh boy, if it wasn't one of the 50 design restrictions attached to him, I wouldn't bother mentioning it. What does he do? He can bounce 1 card. That's right, while Zeus is a full board wipe, this idiot is a single compulse. couldn't even bounce the entire board to, I don't know, parallel Zeus's effect. By its own design, you only have one material, meaning one bounce. And since it's not a quick effect, you can't even use it reactively. It's also a once per turn, because why not? Unlike the idiot who can quick effect activate a board wipe multiple times in the same chain, they couldn't have even given him the ability to bounce more than one card provided he had the material. The fact he isn't a quick effect makes me wonder why he even exists. A card that is designed as the last thing you summon can't be used reactively. He can very easily be outed by spells or traps. Hilariously, the one he is! He only negates big monsters, so anything that has less than 3000 attack can out him as well. Who thought this design made any sense? Zeus is supposed to be the good guy. Typhon is meant to be the bad guy. So tell me why the bad guy obeys every traffic law to the T, while the good guy floors it into a school bus full of children. Typhon's design can best be summed up as measure once, cut 50 times. His floodgate effect and summon condition allude to being intended to address an oppressive board for a low investment, but he also ends your summons for the turn, something that is not remotely low investment. While you can make him as your last summon, you'd have already had to address the board he seems to exist to address. You can't make him going first, normally, so it's not like his effect being a quick effect would have made him an instant staple in every deck. He has so many design restrictions and a severe lack in power that whatever the intended purpose of the card was is entirely lost. It feels like they wanted him to be a staple, but not in every deck, something that is entirely fine and should have been the case. But to do so, they just slapped every restriction that came to mind on it, then made sure the effects weren't remotely strong enough to warrant them, then just never bothered to workshop which restrictions and what power level were actually crucial to balancing the card. Zeus has the design restriction that you can only summon him over an XYZ that battled that turn. Why couldn't they have made Typhon the opposite? Why couldn't he have been a guy you summon at the start of the battle phase, forfeiting your battle phase to make a guy that bounces a board and shuts off big monsters? Typhon's design is the opposite to Zeus in every way, seemingly for the sole purpose of making him bad. Rather than designing him as a cool, powerful monster with strong mechanical parallel theming, he's just made worse in every measure possible. As Typhon exists, it literally only counters Zeus. Shutting off monsters with 3000 or more attack isn't nearly as impactful as it sounds, not when it's attached to this liability. It doesn't even have the angle of the strong should fear the weak going for it. Typhon could have had a damage calc only attack boost so he can always get over Zeus, highlighting an element of underhanded trickery or hidden power on his part. It also creates a thematic and mechanical opening, lowering his floodgate effect during combat since he becomes a monster with over 3000 attack, creating a moment of weakness that could be exploited. But if you wanted to avoid the ruling headache of Typhon interacting with buffing himself over 3000, they could have just given him 3100 defense. Zeus having insane offensive capabilities, whereas Typhon has near indestructible defense, creating this dynamic of an unstoppable force and an immovable object. But instead, we have a card that feels like it's meant to counter Zeus, but also, because he loses in lore, they had to make sure he can very easily still lose regardless. Lovely. Some people refer to Typhon as the surrender button. That doesn't do it justice. Typhon is the card game equivalent of seppuku. You don't get it, man. Just activate Smile World on your opponent's board with monsters that are all just under 3k, then make Typhon. Solved game state. If Typhon wasn't comparing itself to Zeus directly, it would not be nearly as ridiculed a card as it is. But since he's meant to be a direct analog to Zeus, bro just looks like the biggest loser in the universe. But he's good in back row decks. Cool. So are all of these. But with two opposite extremes, maybe we could see something more reasonable come out in the middle. I asked if people wanted to see more cards similar in design to Zeus. The strong majority of people said yes, with the caveat that it's not playable in every XYZ strategy, and a sizable portion saying yes flat out. The issue with Zeus is that he is a tool for just about every XYZ deck, and while he can be less effective in others, can lead to XYZ decks feeling a bit samey. As I've illustrated throughout this video, XYZ is a mechanic with a lot of design nuance. There's plenty of ways to leverage that to make more staples for the mechanic, while also ensuring it's not an automatic include in every XYZ strategy. When it comes to favorites, the top 3 XYZ archetypes were Raid Raptor in first, Sharks in second, and Pearly in third. Raid Raptor is an archetype that's very cool thematically and utilizes the rank up mechanic to fit its theme perfectly. In that regard, I can see why Raid Raptor is one of the most popular archetypes. Sharks also makes sense because it's a Zexal anime archetype with a lot of tools. Namely, Bahamut that would summon Toad to give them a negate, although Bahamut's gone now, so that's out the window. But of course, that isn't the only thing going on with the deck. Pearly was a meta-relevant archetype for a long time, and like Raid Raptors, used the mechanic in a unique way to fit its themes. It also helped that the deck just let you draw a ton of cards. And as always, you could print a card that literally kills you if you use it, but if it says you get to draw a card on it, people will play it. So when it doesn't do that part, people love it even more. With favorite archetypal XYZs, the top 3 were Time Thief Redoer in first, Cyber Dragon Infinity in second, and Teardrop the Rika Queen in third. Redoer is pretty self-explanatory. He's a rank 4 with unique and interesting design, introducing a useful utility and neat gimmick to gameplay. Cyber Dragon Infinity is just a negate. And as you'll realize with a lot of these picks, anything that's generically good, such as a negate or floodgates, will end up as a popular favorite as well as a popular hate, because no one can come to a consensus on the concept of respecting game design. Teardrop I mentioned earlier being one of the XYZs that you can make generically, but gains an added benefit to make her effect better provided you have a plant as material. I have a soft spot for archetypes that use tributing as a means of plussing, so I have just as much love for archetypes that also use tributing as a means of removal. It feels like such an underutilized facet of design, so I can see a reason to like Rika as much as people do. Favorite generic XYZs is where we get to things being predictable. So I might as well include the hated generics in the same breath, as they're damn near identical. Zeus, Baguska, Dweller, and Typhon all show up in both sides of the top 5. And very hilariously, the top 3s are identical. Zeus in first, Bagu in second, and Dweller in third. The only difference in the top 5 is that enough people still have scars from Calamity to remember hating it more than Typhon. The 5th most favorite generic was a tie between Silent Honor Arc and Dark Rebellion, but very hilariously second place was technically Redoer, but he's archetypal, so he's disqualified. Just kind of depressing to realize people forget he actually has an archetype. The contention of these cards is pretty understandable. Zeus is a little too all-encompassing of the mechanic and powerful. I've already gone into detail about how he does sort of limit design as well. So I see Zeus as being the one that's most understandable as polarizing. Baguska and Dweller though, this is just a case of, it's based when I get to floodgate my opponent. I can see the reasoning, but I would never include them in my favorites simply because their design is intrinsically boring and fails to capitalize on the mechanic's design in a way that feels unique. Well, Baguska sort of gets it right with its concept and theming, but it still is a floodgate, and I'm not giving him a pass, no matter how fast the alcohol poisoning acts. When it comes to ranks, we're in a similar situation. Rank 4 is the most hated and liked rank, with rank 8 being the second most liked and third most hated in the game, with rank 3 fittingly being the third most liked, and rank 7 being the second most hated. 4 being number 1 on both sides once again makes sense. It's the most common and has a rich toolbox in the game. Said toolbox having access to cards like Baguska and Dweller, which as we know, are cards hated and liked for their impact on gameplay. It's kinda natural that players resent the most common rank in the game regardless of these cards though, since they will be seeing this pool more than any other. The rank 8 pool is in a similar situation, being one of the more well-developed card pools, while containing negates. Something that isn't exactly a people pleaser when you're staring them down. There's also the fact that Galaxy Eyes is kind of boring. It is just an OTK strategy that isn't very good, and since it's kind of the face of the rank pool, I feel it hampers people's perception of it, especially since the negates are also tied to them. There you go. That's the one mention of the deck in this video. Enjoy it. Probably also doesn't help that they made Gimmick Puppet, the other rank 8 archetype, an FTK strategy. I'm just speedrunning pissing off Zexal fans with this video. What other Zexal archetype haven't I mentioned in a negative light yet? Oh right, Sharks kind of suck. Although that's more because I just find an archetype based on normal-ass sharks not very interesting visually. You need more stupid shit like Arrow Shark for me to start caring. When it comes to rank 3 and 7's placements, I think it has a lot to do with the recent XYZ archetypes, namely Kashtira and Goblin Bikers. Kashtira is by far the most hated XYZ archetype in the game. Spoilers for the next section. And as a result, has kind of shed a negative light on the pool as a whole, since cards like Arise Heart, Shangri-Ira, and Diablosis were doing rather unsavory things in gameplay. There's also potentially scars from the past during Dragon Ruler format. For Goblin Bikers in relation to 3, people love Gabonga, almost solely for his name alone. Cards like Speedroid Terratop and Takatomborg make for a strong rank 3 engine, so a card like Gabonga makes a lot of these rank 3 engines that didn't have many good payoffs before suddenly more worthwhile. The most hated XYZ archetype is Kashtira, then it's Zoo, and then it's Raidraptor. Cash needs no further elaboration, but Zoo and Raidraptor do. Zoo was a tier 0 strategy in its day and has some generally contentious design. It was the first archetype to functionally make every body in the deck full combo, meaning the archetype didn't really have any consistency issues, at a time when most of the game still had some trip-ups when it came to consistency. And when it came to the power of the deck itself, Zoo was in a league of its own. If that wasn't enough to put some people off, they also were just one-card XYZs, which kind of acknowledged the fact that the mechanic often relied on treating multiple monsters as nothing more than material. It felt like cheating and devaluing the mechanic as a whole. Of course, nowadays, I don't even think Zoo is that powerful. Rapier could probably come back to 2 with no real issue. It's another card that has the semi-list type design, and Malicious is currently at 3, so why not? Broad Bull could probably come back and be fine, but that would mean any 2/4s can search out Sangenjin and get the Millennium Engine online. But other than that, who really cares? If anything, I turned fucking French. I think Zoo's more unique design elements age like wine. The ability to make XYZs with other XYZs material easier than rank ups. The ability to cycle names and effects. It's the more interesting parts of the deck that I wish they'd expand on. And of course, I'd like to see them do something more interesting than make Zeus, because that is probably the most boring element of the deck and why people still likely have ill feelings towards it. Raidraptor's inclusion makes sense to me. While I talked about how cool its theming is with rank ups, rising up every time they fall with stronger ranks, embodying an undying will to overthrow the opponent with a rebellion they can't silence. But in actuality, ends up being a tedious combo fest that cycles a million names for the sake of ending on a guy that can't be killed. It's a boring waste of such a cool design theme, and it's certainly a waste of the one archetype in the game that actually makes rank up its entire gimmick. When it comes to the most hated archetypal XYZs, well, first is Arise Heart, second is Kali Yuga, and third is a tie between Rongo and Shangri-Ira. Just outside of the top 3 was Noir, and we've already got a gist of why that is, which is also a 7. It doesn't matter, but certainly a funny coincidence. With both Kashtira XYZs ending up in the top 3 hated archetypal, and rank 7 being the most hated, I think that says it all. Kali Yuga is a floodgate. The mercy of his design is that you have to make him with DD monsters. That is, if you're trying to summon him the traditional way. Kali Yuga is one of the poster children for why rank up magic is a little scary if it's too generic. Being able to cheat out Kali Yuga would just unfairly win games, and this card would show up in Raidraptor. Lovely. And Rongo, who's also here, effectively did the same. Only difference is Rongo didn't need rank ups to be abused, just decks that could either summon out a trillion 4s or make Gossip Shadow to get the floodgate effect online. As I've started to make a habit of, for the State of videos, in the comments I'll have a link to a survey for the next entry pinned down below. Rituals are next up, so I'd appreciate it if you could fill it out and help provide data for the video in the future. Being able to have a physical measure on how people feel about cards helps me form points of discussion and better understand things beyond just my own perspective. So it's a big help. Springins are an XYZ archetype that defy norms, opting to create their XYZ monsters in reverse. With Gold Golgonda, you can discard a Springin and cheat out a Springin XYZ, with the prime target being Merrymaker, who sends his Springins from deck to grave, and since all the Springins are designed with the ability to attach to an XYZ on field when they're in the grave, they all then hop on his material. Although, Golgonda only lets you do this if you don't control a Spriggan's XZ, so it does have to be the first thing you do. You could make more generic XZs beforehand, but the deck isn't super adept at XZ summoning the traditional way. Explorer, their rank 8, lets you fire on a zone and blow up cards in adjacent zones for every material you detach for its cost, creating a benefit for stacking materials onto it. Captain Sargus is a card that utilizes the archetype's easy material stacking further, allowing you to detach a material from XZs, then destroy a face-up card. The problem is, he's a level 8, and the deck isn't too good at getting him on the field. Also, his effect is only on your opponent's turn, so he can't be of any assistance cracking boards on your turn. Very interestingly though, his XYZ's counterpart can destroy or bounce a card if a material is detached, although he can't detach himself, and you do typically make him overtop a Merrymaker. Since he can grab Tally-Ho, you're likely grabbing that so you can actually make another XYZ that'll get his removal effect online. Overall, Spriggan's is an interesting deck that gets a lot of unique design concepts right, yet at the same time seems to hold back on a lot of the elements that would have let them really shine through. Considering the fact cheating out an XYZ with Golgonda means you can't revive it, and the main deck names don't do a whole lot, the deck feels incomplete. I just hope Konami are aware of that and actually make this deck more than just Tally-Ho Turbo. Suship is a deck that needs more extra deck support and main deck searchers to finally set sail. But other than new support for the deck, it highlights another part of XYZ's design to expand on, designing more XYZs to call for specific names, but also provide trade-offs for not having the correct materials. In Suship, it's an incidental benefit if you can make one of the XYZs without Shari, something you likely will almost never be capable of doing, since you can't really assemble the others onto the field without it. If you make any of the XYZs without Shari, the draw effect doesn't count in the application, therefore, it can't get ashed out of applying its effects. I'm pretty certain this wasn't intended nuance in design, but I'd actually like to see it develop into something mechanically interesting, rather than unintentionally fortunate. Despite Burning Abyss being as old as it is, it had good design principles that make it still stand out from most XYZ decks even nowadays. While being designed to let you barf any number of names on the field, like most XYZ archetypes, their restrictions forced you to actually think about who you summon, as using their special summon effects would disallow you from using their grave effect that turn. So your normal summon would translate to the effect you want to use that turn. And while by usual means you could activate a detach effect on your opponent's turn to trigger the effect of the other material, Dante didn't allow for this. And the deck's xenophobic design made generic XYZs a risky commitment, since you'd no longer be able to summon BAs while it's on the field. But with Beatrice, you could gain an XYZ with a detach effect on your opponent's turn to use that effect. She'd also pitch a BA from hand and trigger their effect for her summoning condition. There's also the fact you wouldn't want to throw down every name from hand because you could possibly send them to grave through other means to proc their effects, like the summon of Beatrice or any number of cards that let you pitch a card for an effect. The deck is designed in a way that allows for it to go all in, but is clearly cognizant that there should be checks and balances that deter you from going too crazy, all while encouraging you to actually think about your plays carefully. It's this sort of design that should be more common and further iterated on with XYZ strategies. Burning Abyss is just a worse Vanquish Soul. I said it. Choosing between one of two effects per turn. Inherent design that punishes overextension. A guy that burns your opponent out of games. At least Vanquish Soul isn't xenophobic. In fact, it's inclusive. Not a single same type monster in this deck. Other than the xenophobia, BA's other issue is that very few of the names are good in the context of going first. And certainly not in the year 2025. They don't have enough cards in Archetype to really leverage using their interactive effects efficiently. While the deck certainly could use new cards of its own, it should let in others as well. Otherwise, it'll always depend on more direct support to keep up with the game. But who knows? They printed a card to fundamentally change how these idiots work, and a card that just changes the card text on Allure Queen. It's been a decade since BA was released. I think we can grow past the bigotry at this point. Exosister is an XYZ archetype that, while it doesn't use named materials, ups to gain effects if made with at least one material from its native archetype. But the most interesting part of their design is that they intend to perform an XYZ summon on your opponent's turn as disruption. This sort of design helps alleviate the issue of game mechanics feeling like like they're just spinning their wheels for minutes on end to perform drawn-out combos. The only real issue with this design is that they require your opponent to move a card in the grave for them to trigger, and while that's relatively common nowadays, it's usually pretty easy to avoid, as they're all built like the sheets of paper their game plan was written on. And when they aren't designed to actually get two bodies on field consistently, well, the deck kind of falls apart entirely. Martha would release later and at least give the deck a good means of getting two bodies on field. However, this is too little too late. And the Xenolock wasn't really warranted, especially since she's the only good name in the deck. But with the upcoming Tactical Tri-deck, if the waves of support for the last three are anything to go off of, they're probably going to get support soon. Hopefully more ways to XYZ on your opponent's turn, or a set of cards you give to your opponent to trigger them. The only real concern being maybe making the tactics spells a little too good for Exosister specifically, as well as the issues that usually come with gifting monsters to your opponent. When it comes to expanding the pools of certain ranks, Mimighoul is a unique and interestingly designed deck that helps flesh out the rank 1 pool. Mimighoul is also a flip deck designed to give its monsters to your opponent and provide benefits to you when your opponent flips them. The deck is very weak stat-wise, and since you give them to your opponent, that can be a benefit. The deck is kind of underwhelming as it is now, but if they receive future support, or Konami actually builds up the rank 1 pool, I can see them cropping back up again one day. The only real annoying thing about them is their name. Bro, they just made a Pokemon called Gimmighoul. You can't be doing this. Matereactor is currently the only dedicated rank 3 strategy, and I love its usage of vanilla monsters and its material gimmick. Right now, it's hard to actually call it an archetype, as it's just 4 main deck names and a couple spell traps that aren't super good at doing the thing they're intending to do. I really do like the design gimmick of recycling your materials back to hand and hope to see it explored even further, as using XYZ materials beyond just making an XYZ monster makes the mechanic more engaging and interesting. It's sort of hard to design decks solely as an XYZ only strategy without a restriction to it, as links have been and continue to be a prevalent part of the functionality of decks. But even ignoring links, locking archetypes to XYZ only limits what these archetypes can do as a whole. So we're well past the point of every XYZ archetype being purely built around the mechanic. I just hope this isn't used as an excuse to slack off on expanding rank pools that need it. Goblin Bikers are up there with Suship as one of my favorite XYZ archetypes in the game, and that's because they take a unique approach to the mechanic and their design. Although I enjoy design like Suships that has the names of the materials mattering, Goblin Biker takes a different approach to the mechanic that makes great use of the functionality of XYZ material, opting to use XYZ material in general as a means of resource management for the archetype. Each of the main deck 3s all have the ability to special themselves by yoinking an XYZ material off the field, and since they don't specify the XYZ material has to be underneath your own monster, they can rip off materials from an opponent's XYZ as well. When you consider the fact Ryzeal, currently the best deck in the game, is an XYZ strategy, this archetype has an inherent advantage interacting with them even winning against them in OYCS. I don't care about the mementos. Doug and Gabonga carried. This element of design to Goblin Bikers is also reminiscent of a biker gang, gathering around someone who's entered their turf, surrounding them for riding up in their territory with a cheap set of wheels. I also like Gabonga's design, being removal that triggers whenever an XYZ material is detached. Troika sucks, but it is funny to consider it only really exists as a means to trigger Gabonga's absorption effect. A lot of old Zexal era cards were designed in a way indicative of the time, making cards that counter XYZ because they were the new mechanic. Of course, not every deck under the sun plays them, so these tend to be useless. So, seeing an archetype like Goblin Biker that is an XYZ deck that has the flexibility to counter other XYZ decks is refreshing design to see. I also appreciate that Goblin Biker decided to include the non-biker goblins for some reason. Usually archetypes like these that use a moniker that applies to other generic cards goes through the rigmarole of including the text except for blank, etc. This is why they showed up alongside Memento, but it's also just generally funny to think of the old level 4 goblins being recruited into their ranks. Just look at the goblin attack force, and tell me the image of them all rolling up on Harleys doesn't go hard. Why is the female goblin called Mean Merciless? Sexist much, Konami? Or is there something else you have to tell us? Speaking of bad bitches, K9 is a new XYZ archetype that actually chooses to cover one of the most underdeveloped ranks in 5. 2 of their main deck monsters are designed to interact with hand traps and grave effects, which are near unavoidable in the modern game. Izuna works similarly to how Havness did for Tyr. They chose the approach of starting your game plan on your opponent's turn as an interruption, rather than trying to prevent your opponent from playing entirely. Just like Havness, Izuna is the only turn 0 card in the archetype, so it does rely on drawing her. While Izuna's XYZ counterpart Ripper is a negate of the effect types that summoned Izuna, you had to let a card go through first to make it, so you're likely going to be negating a card of lesser value, meaning your opponent is likely to still be able to play if they played their cards right, which is more nuanced design balance than negates typically get. Lupus is the other card designed like her, but that requires Izuna herself to set him up. He can perform an XYZ summon on your opponent's turn, which I always appreciate seeing. However, the context for doing so is either dependent on you opening Izuna to bin him if you're going second, or you choosing to leave material on the field to do it later, because you can't XYZ summon a card with just him. Or can you? Yeah, so he can just make Typhon on your opponent's turn. I'm gonna be real with you, I still don't think it's worth it. For one, all you get out of that is a negate for 3k idiots. And for 2, K9 wants to summon on your opponent's turn. Good cards, even. So it doesn't seem like a sound decision. Werewolf is a boss monster after my own heart. They printed multi-attacking on him. That's all they had to do. And it's based on the number of materials attached to him. Just like Ripper, he has an effect that interacts with hand traps and grave effects, with the effect in question depending on whose turn it is. During your turn, he banishes a card from your opponent's field and a card from their grave. If it's your opponent's turn, he hand rips while providing hand knowledge. I'm not a fan of hand ripping, but once again, the design isn't intending for you to get to him immediately to punish your opponent for interacting in general. While I still don't like the principle, I appreciate the versatility and effects based on the turn player while requiring setup to get to. Generator can make Werewolf though. Well, if they could actually make XYZ, well, they could. You may now take into account this is a rank 9 in a rank 5 strategy. Lupus's intended rank 5 is less impressive. He has protection the turn he's summoned and gains 500 attack every time your opponent activates a monster effect. Then, during the standby phase, he can banish a card. That's it. He's not bad, he's just not doing a whole lot. But since the deck has its own mask change, it doesn't really matter if he's not the best, as he can just be used as a pivoting point for the deck. I will say, the one disappointment with K9 is that they chose to just copy mask change for the deck. I would have liked to have seen it be more of a hybrid between mask change and rank up magic, giving their XYZs more effects if you make them with the mask change. K9 still leans into the issues with higher level XYZ decks. While you can summon them easier than the average 5, Konami still seems to be terrified of a level 5 that outclasses Cyber Dragon, making them all dependent on your opponent having 2 or more cards in hand to normal them without tribute. I would like to remind everyone they printed the Bestials. Is the level 6 the difference? You can't power creep Cyber Dragon with another level 5. Is that the issue? You know, I can see the case for the hand cost because Werewolf hand rips, so there's a motivation not to hand rip your opponent. But if you're going second, better hope your opponent didn't play their whole hand when you clearly didn't open Izuna. Yokel and Lantern are your other 5s, and they can special summon, but Yokel's also the only one that can do so without setup. Hopefully we see more in the future, but regardless, I still love the archetype's design and hope Konami keeps up the pace and makes more archetypes for the ranks that they've left to rot. Pearly is one of the only decks to stack a bunch of materials as a game plan. It felt as though after Zeus and Zoo's interaction, Konami was hesitant to explore this type of design again, but I'm glad to see it come back in such a unique way. While I can't say I care much for making a big unaffected idiot as a game plan, I do appreciate the playstyle of the memories, giving your Pearly more effects to utilize. And since they would let you draw cards, and people will literally, metaphorically shoot themselves just for the chance to draw a card, it scratched an itch for many players. While Zodiac doesn't come up much anymore, I still think it's worth evaluating the power of being able to make an XYZ with just one card. Cards like Puppet Shark and XYZ Poseidon Splash are very interesting prospects, but of course are traps. There's also Dimension Slice that lets you use it immediately if you XYZ summon, but that's not very good. There are just so many XYZ related cards that I think this ability to make an XYZ with one monster will unlock a fun sandbox at some point. Another facet of design that I'd like to see explored is using XYZ evolution for more abstract goals. In Duel Links, I found playing with Mech Knights extremely fun, and not because of their intended playstyle. Mech Knight is an archetype that gives you the ability to summon their monsters to a column that is occupied by 2 or more cards. This sort of design is bad in the context of going first, but one of the ways to work around it, that wasn't the skill that just gave your opponent a card, was to make an extra deck monster, then set a back row in the same column to get you off to the races. Since the archetype has 6s and 8s, you could tribute summon a 6 over a card occupying a zone another Mech Knight could be special to, then you could overlay your 6s or 8s into an Xyz and put them in the EMZ. For a 6, you could make Exabeetle, who puts a card in a back row column to further help get out Mech Knights. Then you could make Rhinoceros over top of it and move it to the other EMZ to convert that zone into a Mech Knight column. And with 8s, you could do this with Prime Photon and Full Armor. It was extremely fun to utilize evolutions to further combos for the deck and gave more weight to the mechanic as a whole, all while giving the deck a unique flavor with its ability to combo. I want to see an archetype that taps into this sort of design and really makes good use of it. When it comes to Xyz approaching XYZ Material differently, while Gabunga slurps up a single monster on field, Leviathan can tag into Jormungandr and attach cards from either field or graveyard to it as material, with the number of cards being equal to how many materials it had attached to it when it was tributed, giving a really powerful payoff to an Xyz made with more than 2 materials, while also still being really good with just 2. It's just a shame it's a rank 9, so it's not exactly easy to make use of that flexibility, even in its native archetype. Really want to see more Xyz that make use of absorbing monsters as material as a form of unique removal, since you kinda get to hold your opponent's cards hostage without destroying them or setting up any grave or banishment effects. It's a wholly unique interaction that provides a type of removal no other mechanic can. Armored Fortress creates a mini-engine for rank 3 and 4s to use. It can also bridge into Dark Lancer and use the equipping of the related Xyz cards as a form of removal. While you can make Dark Lancer with any 5 or 6, it's clear you're going to make him with Fortress or any of the Shark cards, because he isn't much use to rank 5 or 6 strategies. At least not unless they develop other ways to equip on your opponent's turn. So I hope there can be more engine bridges for these higher ranks, especially since 4s aren't the pool hurting for them. Ryziel is the latest rank 4 archetype, being one of, if not the best decks in the game currently, and making great use of the existing rank 4 pool. Very intelligent and brave design to make the archetype lock into rank 4s. Wouldn't want anything interesting to be possible. Thankfully, the TCGs finally banned Dweller to curb the less savory part of their playability. But of course, Ryziel's own cards are still responsible for its success, with Detonator as its strongest asset, being a 2-mat Xyz that's functionally a 3-mat by grabbing another material from grave. Detonator can pop a card by detaching a material when your opponent activates a card or effect, mercifully choosing to spare us from a negation boss monster, because they put it on the field spell for some reason. Detonator can also detach for protection of your Xyz, with both detach effects not being limited to turn, but just how many materials it has that it can detach. Duo Drive is a hell of a card. It's extremely funny that it's not even seen as a card that searches 2 cards, but rather a card that eats a negate, since your opponent can't afford to let you functionally resolve a Pot of Greed with crafted draws. I'm not sure how I feel about a card being designed to eat negates, considering the scenario where it doesn't means you get insane card value that isn't remotely fair. I do like that Detonator and the field spell use their materials as general resources for their game plan, but find the field spell's usage of doing so uninspired. Despite the fact the deck is dominating the meta, it feels incomplete. It's just a powerful and consistent deck, even in its current state. It just feels as though it's lacking more depth to its material management, and if anything, that's what I want to see expanded upon in the deck. An Xyz archetype that dominated the game at one point in its history that I think is worth revisiting is Windup. The interesting thing about Windup to me is the level modulation alongside the rank 3s and the 1 of 4 and 5. I think it'd be a great idea to pivot the archetype to being a rank up and down archetype. They have the capacity to make them all naturally, but it'd be interesting to see them use the sub-mechanics to more flexibly make them. Even potentially get more benefits with Xyz underneath them. They could just make a new archetype for this, but I think it'd be nice to bring Windup with this since the groundwork is already there. In my video on Battle and Boxer, in regards to their 3-mat, I came up with the idea of a card that would summon out every other copy of a Boxer you had on field and make the 3-mat XYZs. It doesn't outright invalidate the 3-mat cost, like cards like Drake Shark, but finds a way to make them easier to summon in archetype, giving the archetype itself a payoff to running them, since the XYZs still typically want to be able to use all 3 materials for effect cost. This design deters generic abuse, but still allows for generic cards to synergize in scenarios where it's relevant, all while actually making the card worth playing. I want to see approaches similar to this taken for 3-mat XYZs because, as they are now, they feel pointless if the only means of addressing it is cards that narrow the material cost by 1. Despite XYZs being a mechanic plagued with the most consistently lazy design, it's perhaps one of the most unique mechanics in the game. It has so much potential to be explored even now. There's so many layers to their design that it leaves room for so much experimentation and design creativity. I can only hope that Konami continues to expand on the more recent excursions of the mechanic, as they've made them exceed the limitations of their predecessors.